what is carnism?
Yeah, so carnism is the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals. I'll tell you a little bit about where this term came from, and it'll make it easier to grasp, so it's not an abstraction. Carnism was what I identified in my doctoral research when I was studying the psychology of eating animals. And that research emerged out of my own personal experience, which was probably not terribly different than many people's experience in the audience. Like many people in the world, I grew up with a dog who I loved, and I also grew up eating meat, eggs, and dairy. And for many years, I never thought about how strange it was that I could pet my dog with one hand while I ate a pork chop with the other, a pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as sentient and intelligent as my dog. I just didn't make the connection between the meat on my plate and the individual it once was. All that changed in 1989 when I ate a hamburger that had been contaminated by Campylobacter, which is basically the red meat version of salmonella. And I wound up on intravenous antibiotics in Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. I was incredibly sick. And I just, at that point, became a vegetarian sort of by accident. And and so this was back in 1989. I was 23 years old at the time. It was a long time ago. And so I started, having to learn about how to cook for myself, how to shop for myself as a vegetarian. And what I learned shocked and horrified me. I just could not believe the extent of the harm to farmed animals, the suffering. I couldn't believe what was happening to the environment. And, people barely knew then what they know now. And I couldn't believe what was happening to my body, to human health from consuming these products. And so I was just shocked and horrified. But what shocked me in some ways even more was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say. They would always say something like, "Don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal," or they'd call me a radical, vegan. I became vegan during this period, a radical vegan hippie propagandist. And so I became very curious as to how rational, caring people like I had been, like my friends and family were, who were reacting this way, we could all just, check our critical thinking at the door and shut down our empathy when it came to this issue of eating animals. And that led me to do my research to really explore the psychology of eating animals. And what I discovered was that there is this invisible belief system that I named carnism that conditions us to eat certain animals. Carnism basically conditions us to have distorted perceptions when it comes to those animals we've learned to classify as edible, and also the products procured from their bodies, right? And to disconnect from our natural empathy, our natural experience when we eat them. So I can talk more about this system and what it looks like and how it affects us psychologically to break this down so it's not abstract. But that's what carnism essentially is. You can think of it as the opposite of veganism. We often assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system, but the only reason that we might learn to eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity, which is true, for anybody who can make their food choices freely, then it's a choice, and choices always stem from beliefs.
So how did defining carnism, or at least what is with your goal of defining carnism, impact your ability to communicate to others? And what have you seen that was, I guess, assuming more challenging before you had the words and the language to do so versus once you came up with the concept, or you basically described the concept of carnism?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. So, first of all, what I was really interested in with my research was the psychology of carnism. So what is happening inside people's minds? And I include myself in that because I had eaten animals for most of my life at the point, when I did this research. What is happening in people's minds so that those of us, the vast majority of people would be deeply offended by what they saw if they actually knew what was going on, if they actually experienced what was going on, what was happening to non-human animals, and would never, ever want to participate in extensive, intensive, and completely unnecessary violence toward animals. And yet the vast majority of people aren't directly participating in that. So I was really looking at the psychological mechanisms because I figured if I could understand what the thinking is, and I could also understand how to shift this thinking to open up a conversation so that we could work to, invite people into this conversation about how to move toward veganism. So I can break down the specific defense mechanisms that I'm talking about so they're not an abstraction for people. But to answer your question, how does this help to communicate about the issue? For people who you don't have to use the term carnism or even the concept of carnism when you're talking. If you want to, if you're talking to somebody in your life who is not vegan and they're not plant-based, they're just not on board for whatever reason, you don't have to bring up the concept of carnism. There are strategies, and we can talk about these specific strategies of how you can invite them into a conversation, in different ways. However, sometimes the concept works really well. And in particular, when you're already not eating animals anymore, understanding carnism helps you understand the psychology of the people in your life who you might be reaching out to, you might be trying to communicate with, who are, probably a lot of people on this call right now can understand or watching this. Sometimes all you have to do is say, I don't eat meat. And all of a sudden you feel that wall of defensiveness go up. When you understand carnism, you understand where these defenses come from. You understand, and I could talk about highlighting them so that that it reduces them. And it really helps you to not engage in a battle of defenses, a battle of justification. So you're talking about, eating plant-based, and the other person is saying, oh, but what would happen to all the animals if we stopped eating them? And you say, well, but we wouldn't have to worry about all the animals if we stopped eating them because we'd stop breeding them. And it's so easy to get into these debates. When you recognize the defensive psychology behind the debate, then you don't engage with it, and you can take the conversation to a different level, right? And so sometimes you have to debunk some myths. So, if somebody really thinks they're going to die if they stop eating animals, there's nowhere to go unless you address that. But when you understand the psychology, you're less likely to get really frustrated when people throw at you these sort of defensive attempts to shut down the conversation, because you see that as kind of an inevitability, and it's not really the other person's fault because they've inherited and absorbed this mentality that they don't even realize they have. Carnism causes people to feel defensive against and reject anyone or anything that would help them get out of the carnistic box. So when you expect the defensiveness and you see it for what it is, you're less likely to get triggered and upset by it.
Thank you. And so what would a conversation look like? Hey, I can just imagine I'm sitting down, and people know that I'm plant-based in my world and I'm vegan, and I don't even have to say anything, and they'll start being like, oh, I don't normally eat this, or the defensiveness is instant, and you don't have to do anything. And I tend not to debate with anybody, but what would a conversation look like? Someone sits down and you order something, and you tell the wait staff that you're plant-based or you're vegan, and that the next thing the person goes, well, what would happen to all the animals? How should a person respond to that to not play their role in this classic dynamic that ultimately, I guess, helps carnism, because you never end up winning that battle? So what would that conversation look like?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So one thing I'll point out is just the basics of, I think everybody in the world, would do well to learn the basics of effective communication, just in general. It applies to everything, not just talking about eating animals or not eating animals. And in an effective communication, I'll just give you a really quick explanation of what that looks like. All communications have two parts, the content and the process. The content is what we're communicating about. Right? So right now the content is communication. The process is how we're communicating. We tend to over-focus on the process, the content, and under-focus on the process, but the process matters much more. So if you think about a conversation you had 6 months ago, right? You might have entirely forgot the content. You don't even remember what you talked about, but you probably still remember how you felt in that conversation. The process determines how we feel. When your process is healthy, you can talk about anything without arguing. And when your process is not healthy, you can't talk about anything without arguing. You might know people who are totally on the same page about things and yet still find a way to fight with each other.
Mhm.
So when your process is healthy, your goal is not to be right, which means to make the other person wrong. It's not to win, which means to make the other person lose. Your goal is mutual understanding. The only reason we communicate in the first place is because we're not mind readers. The goal of communication is to have the other person understand your thoughts and feelings and needs, and for you to understand their thoughts and feelings and needs. So that has to be the primary goal of any communication. What this means is that when mutual understanding is our primary goal, we never debate, we just discuss. That's the goal of a discussion. The goal of a debate is to win. When you invite somebody into a debate with you, or when you start debating somebody, basically what we're doing is we're inviting them to come up with all of the reasons they possibly can to explain and to convince us as to why their perspective, their opinion is right. And by the end of the conversation, they will have convinced themselves on the rightness of their position even more than when they started. So avoid debating. And when somebody starts talking, when you're talking to somebody, I always recommend communicating by using your story. Share your story rather than you should, or this is what happens. This is why I became vegan. Right? Like before you even get into this, well, what would happen with all the animals? I mean, sometimes, yes, you can engage with that a little bit because you don't want to just ignore a question, but bring it back. Here's my story. Most of what happens is people say, why did you become vegan? Why did you stop eating animals? Everybody has a story. Nobody can make your story wrong. So you share your experience. You can also invite people, and I'm guessing that a lot of people who are listening right now, are thinking about, for people who are plant-based or even almost fully plant-based, thinking about their own family and friends and the difficulty and frustration that they experience in, feeling like those other people are resistant to their message and their way of being. And a lot of us try to force the people in our lives to become vegan. And that usually doesn't work. So I always recommend inviting the people in your life to learn about veganism and say to them, if you have somebody in your life, right, who you have any degree of closeness with, you have an absolute right to ask them, not to say what they should and shouldn't be eating, but to say to them, listen, I would really appreciate being able to share information about veganism, about plant-based eating, however you frame it, with you, not to change you, but so that you understand me, because this is really important to me. This is really important in my life. I want you to see what the world looks like through my eyes and what matters to me. And you're inviting them to become an ally to you. And a lot of people find that they don't need the people in their lives to stop eating animals entirely. They just need to know that they're understood and respected and supported in their own journey and their own choices.
Thank you. So it's a stereotype out in the world about vegans that they tend to be judgy, and how do you know someone's vegan? That they'll tell you, right? So having been vegan for almost 10 years now, I've met many people who would fit that stereotype. Have you, based on what you're saying, it sounds like that is very counterproductive to come off as judgmental. Have, since you've put out your work, has that helped people? And have you seen an impact with regard to how people in the vegan movement or plant-based movement communicate the message more effectively to I don't know if you call them carnists, meat eaters?
Non-vegans, yeah.
Non-vegans. Okay. Non-vegans.
Yeah, I mean, so just since this movement has been gaining traction and more popularity and more understanding, there has certainly been, there's more training and awareness has grown about effective communication strategies. So there's definitely been a shift in the sort of primary or more common way of communicating. And nevertheless, vegans are people, and and most people have never got a single formal lesson on how to communicate or relate in a way that's effective. and healthy, you know, and I said this before, I think in our last interview, actually, and I'll say it again because it really matters. You know, most of us have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use. And we don't get a single formal lesson in how to communicate effectively and how to be healthy relational beings. And when you look at the problems, you know, that the biggest problems in our personal lives and in our world, these are not problems that are caused by people who don't know how to do geometry. So vegans and all people, you know, tend to, when there is a difference of opinion, you know, even about something as simple as whether to go out or stay in on a Saturday night, let alone when it comes to like a major ethical difference, ethical issue, most people tend to get judgmental and to assume that those who have a different opinion from them are somehow less than, and somehow, you know, somehow less than, somehow inferior, and to look down on them. So then when we add this sort of ethical layer to it and the insanity of carnism that we've been born into, it's very hard not to get into a place where you're feeling judgment and moral outrage, you know, when you're a vegan. And so yes, this is a common response. It's an understandable response. And at the same time, it's problematic. To the degree that we can reduce our judgment of people, this is the degree that we increase the chances that they hear that our message is heard the way that we intend it to be. And I'll explain this a little bit more. I'll explain this a little bit more clearly. So I'm going to talk about shame. When we communicate in the way that is judgmental, what we're doing is we're communicating that the other person is somehow less than, is somehow inferior, right? So if somebody looks down on you, usually you know this. When we communicate in a way that that is judgmental, we are inevitably communicating in a way that is shaming toward them. Research has shown that people respond to being shamed and just to the threat of being shamed by becoming what's called dysregulated. When you're dysregulated or emotionally dysregulated, that means your nervous system is out of balance. You know what it feels like because everybody is in and out of dysregulation throughout any given day, right? So you can be wildly dysregulated and feel kind of like, woof, like kind of hijacked by your emotions and really riled up, or you can be mildly dysregulated. Either way, when you are dysregulated, when a person is dysregulated, they have less access to their rational faculties, so they're thinking less rationally, and they're less connected to their empathy. Research has shown that people who feel shamed by somebody else or people who feel the threat of being shamed become dysregulated. So if you're communicating in a way with somebody that's judgmental, you are increasing the chances that you are going to trigger dysregulation in them. And that means that they are less likely to hear your message, because when people are dysregulated, generally what they want to do or what they do is they either withdraw or attack in self-defense. They shut down because they don't experience us as emotionally safe. So it's a good idea to try to not be judgmental to begin with, because this hurts you when you're feeling judgmental. And it also is a good idea to do that because if we want to have impact and win people to our cause, we need to come from a different place so that we're more inviting and we increase the chances that people will be open to what we have to say.
So do you find that there's a natural inclination, and you see this in the movement, that people are more obsessed with being pure, right, than they are to being practical and effective? Is that a problem? I guess it would be with people in general, where if they have a belief system, they're going to push it with the intent of just being true to themselves, and they're going to say what they think, as opposed to getting into a conversation with the goal of having an impact on someone's view of the world, I guess in this case.
Yeah, well, what you're saying is true in that, very, very often those of us who are part of this movement, and we care so much. I mean, I don't think I've ever met somebody in this movement who hasn't deeply, deeply cared. Our caring is our gift, and our caring is also our kryptonite. So, and this is, I think, what we're getting to now with the purity versus impact focus. People care a lot, and most of us have not really, most people get more instruction in how to operate a cash register than they do in how to change the world, you know? So we stumble into this cause, we do the best we can with what we have. Many people end up becoming traumatized because of what's going on, because we have been born into the midst of a complete and utter mess. We've been born into what can only be called a global atrocity. And, you know, this has an effect on us psychologically. Many people are traumatized from having witnessed, you know, horrible animal cruelty and suffering. We have high rates of dysregulation for this reason, and simply because we live in a world that daily offends our deepest sensibilities. You know, it's crazy making. We walk out the door, you know, and you see a truck of body parts driving by. You sit across, you know, the table from people you love deeply, and they're putting the bodies of dead animals into their mouths, petting their dog in the process, and looking at you like something's wrong with you because you're not on board with this. It really is crazy making in some ways, excuse the expression, but it really does affect us psychologically. And so most people in this movement haven't gotten the training and haven't gotten the tools they need and are doing the best they can with what they have. And naturally, this feeling, this sense of urgency that so many people have, coupled with this dysregulation that many of us have, coupled with the fact that like the issue that we're grappling with is you have to go through a lot of mental gymnastics to get through a day and hold these multiple truths in your mind at the same time. I love this person here and have total respect for them, and they're doing something that's completely antithetical to my values, right? So this makes it really hard. A lot of people are focused in the movement, are focused on what we might call purity, and it makes sense because the idea is as long as you're putting dead bodies into your mouth, you're part of the problem, right? So from a like kind of a logical perspective, that makes sense, but from a psychological perspective, it doesn't. This is where psychology is so important. We are all deeply conditioned to do things that are against our core values, right? I mean, I have clothes. I tried to buy used clothing, but sometimes I have to go to H&M because I need something and I need it quickly and I buy it. I don't feel good about it. That's not in alignment with my value system to support fast fashion in any way, shape, or form. But we have inherited a very messy world, and we have to make imperfect choices in a world that is so imperfect. And so people who are focused on, you know, just kind of like not eating anything that's got any animal in it whatsoever, and, you know, assuming that you're not part of the solution unless you are perfectly vegan 100% of the time. I understand where that mentality is coming from. I believed that myself many years ago when I first became vegan. I was thinking that way too, and it makes sense logically. But then when you really think about it psychologically, you know, you realize that all of us have to live with a lot of contradictions in our lives because, you know, we have to relate to the world the way it is rather than the way we wish it were. The world is not perfect, so we have to make imperfect decisions. And for some people, becoming fully vegan does not feel possible for them, even if it looks like it is. And this is why it's so important for vegans to really make their bottom line impact. Like, ask yourself, what is this behavior? What is going to have the biggest impact? What is going to help the largest number of individuals? What is going to push the vegan needle forward as much as possible? And the answer to that question is very often not going vegan, or at least individuals going vegan. So for example, some of the people who have done the most for this cause are people who are not vegan and not even vegetarian, who interview me for major publications and get this message out to hundreds of thousands of readers. That just on an impact level alone, that probably does far more good for animals' lives than not eating animals for an entire lifetime would. That's impact. Some of the donors, some people who are donating massive amounts of money to vegan-related activities, they're eating animals in the process, but the amount of giving that they are doing is saving far more animals' lives than they ever would if they were simply not eating animals themselves. So when we think about impact, it helps us to sort of expand our horizons, and we stop saying to people, you know, you can't be a part of this cause until you're ready and willing to completely stop animals 100%. If we do that, we prevent people from supporting a cause that needs all the help it can get.
So along what you're saying right now, which is, it sounds like sometimes that purity can be counterproductive, right? If it prevents going on a show, for example, where someone has an audience of 1 million people and they're not vegan, but you won't go on to, go on the show because they're vegan. And you see this play out with people's response to Beyond Meat getting into China. And there was animal testing that needed to be done, and people didn't want Beyond Meat to do the animal testing, which, and I understand the natural inclination, but maybe it would have been the cost of 100 animals or whatever it is, but it has the impact of potentially saving millions or hundreds of millions of animals by giving an alternative to people in China to eating the actual meat. Can you talk about that dynamic of people doing things that perhaps are counterproductive in their goal and their pursuit of furthering the movement?
I mean, there are some really tricky questions that people have to only answer themselves, right? So if you use this sort of like utilitarian, like hypothetical and say, would you kill one infant, one human infant yourself with your own hands, if you knew it would save 100,000 other infants? Most people are going to say no, because most people, this is what we know, most people would say no, because most people don't feel that they have the capability to do it, and they don't want the responsibility of having made that decision. Fortunately, so there are naughty situations that I don't have the answer to, nobody really has the answer to, and people have to come to themselves. That said, as long as people are approaching these questions with the goal in mind of doing the most good within reason, I think that is what's important for us to have the productive conversations that we need to have. And for example, I'm not sure that purity is the right word. I mean, I very much understand that many people really do want to do as much as they possibly can to offset the harm they're doing in the world. And that's commendable. It's also important to remember that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And to just, for individuals who are listening, to give yourself permission to keep checking in with yourself and asking yourself when you are making decisions, 2 questions. One, and they're related. One, is this decision in the best interest of my sustainability? That means my ability to maintain not only my veganism, but my vegan advocacy for the long haul. So if you're too, if the way that you're relating to your veganism is such that it's tormenting you because you're having to constantly navigate choices that feel too difficult for you, your beloved 95-year-old grandmother just baked you vegan cookies, and it turns out that they're not really vegan because the margarine wasn't really margarine that she put in them, right? The questions like this, give yourself permission to have a little bit of wiggle room when it's necessary to, because if you don't, this is one of the reasons people burn out. And one of the worst things to happen for the movement and for the animals is to have higher rates of burnout than we already have. We have a lot of people in this movement who are highly committed, deeply, deeply committed and passionate, who are burning out because they can't sustain the bar that they've set for themselves, because they don't give themselves enough wiggle room to have a life that feels sustainable to them. And I'm not saying to go out and start hunting or something. I'm talking about, nuances. And, and this also includes nuances in or I should say, the relationships you have with other people. One of the reasons that my latest research actually has been on burnout in the movement. And one of the reasons that we have such high rates of burnout is because vegans are relating to other vegans in ways that are causing them to feel betrayed and demoralized and judged for not being enough and, other things. And this is doing far more harm to animals than the vegans who are not checking the label of their wine bottles to make sure that the wine is certified vegan. So you really create wiggle room in your life so that your life feels as sustainable as possible. And what that means is check in with yourself on a daily basis. I would say multiple times a day, and ask yourself, am I regulated? Do I feel regulated or do I feel dysregulated? What's happening with my nervous system right now? Ask yourself that. Then ask yourself what you need in order to get into a state of regulation. I have some great resources I can share for self-regulating, and give yourself permission to do that, because what this movement needs is healthy people who can stay in it for the long haul and who are going to help foster a movement that's resilient and effective.
Thank you. So your method for communicating, or the one that you advocate, is that akin to the Socratic method, where you're kind of going on a journey with somebody and asking questions to kind of bring them to their own conclusions that may move them in the direction that you want? Is that what it would be like?
I mean, it could be. What I was talking about was just sort of the foundation of effective communication. The Socratic method is like, as you were saying, inviting people in through a series of questioning. And I think we don't ask enough questions and listen enough. Most of us talk more than we listen. And to the degree that you can increase the questions you're asking and the listening you're doing, I think is the degree that you'll probably be more effective for most people anyway. Not necessarily everybody. At the same time, the Socratic method only works. I've seen people use the Socratic method counterproductively. I don't know if it's more often than not, but often enough, where a person's not actually asking questions with genuine curiosity, but they have a plan to bring somebody through a series of questions so that they can get them to a predetermined goal. And that is antithetical to the method that I was talking about, which is a healthy process where your goal is really mutual understanding. We can't, advocacy is not about making people change their minds. It's about creating an environment where people can open their minds and providing information that helps them to do that. We can't be attached to the outcome as much as we would like a certain outcome. As soon as you're attached to the outcome of a communication, it sets you up to start to be controlling. It's sort of like if somebody asks you for advice about their marriage or something, and you give them advice, but with that advice, you're really attached to them following it. If they don't follow it, you're going to get annoyed with them and maybe start trying to push them to make decisions rather than allowing them to be the expert on themselves and their own relationship. And the minute we don't allow somebody to be the expert in their own experience, we end up causing them likely to get defensive against what we're saying.
Thank you. I really appreciate that distinction. So, is Carnism its own thing, or is it an expression of a larger social construct? The way that we see certain things, I think it was Noam Chomsky who talked about worthy victims and unworthy victims. Is this similar to that construct? Is this just a permutation of somewhat, like almost like a strategic morality that is a system of having people's belief system justify whatever the system needs to be justified?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So the answer is yes to both. It's both. So Carnism, my most recent book is called How to End Injustice Everywhere. And that book is basically about the meta system, like the overarching system. We can say it's the hub of the wheel that the spoke of carnism and racism and classism and ageism and all of the other isms stem. So carnism is structured like any other unjust system. I just named a few of them. Mm-hmm. All of these systems, I want to actually point out that the victims of each system, the experience of the victims of each set of victims of the systems will always be unique. I am not comparing the suffering of victims. But the victims, the systems themselves are structured the same way. And most importantly, the mentality that drives the injustice, that drives the violence is the same. The same mentality that drives us to exploit and consume farmed animals is the mentality that causes us to exploit and consume human animals and the environment and so on.
Can you speak to the psychological mechanism of denial that people have either in the larger system, but I guess more specifically though, in the context of eating animals or certain animals?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs and Wear Cows, that book was deconstructing carnism, and I talk about the various defense mechanisms that keep carnism alive. And the primary defense of the system is denial. If we deny there's a problem in the first place, then we don't have to do anything about it. The main way denial shows up is through invisibility. Right. So the victims of the system are invisible. Literally trillions of non-human animals, farmed animals who are slaughtered every year for carnistic agribusiness. They are kept out of sight and therefore conveniently out of public consciousness. And the system itself is invisible by being unnamed. It's like there are vegans and vegetarians, and there's everybody else, all the normal people. So denial plays a critical role in maintaining the system, but it's one of many defenses of the system. And one of the reasons that I founded Beyond Carnism, whose mission it is to expose and transform carnism, is because I very much believe that when the concept of carnism is widely recognized enough, it will fundamentally change the nature of how we think and talk about the issue of eating animals.
So how does the power of language determine how people perceive things and whether or not a message is effective? For example, people use the term beef and not cows, right? We come up with these code words to separate the animal from what's on your plate, and how, and even if you called somebody, if you wanted to name them, we're vegans or plant-based eaters, they would be meat eaters. But that even separates the idea that these are animals. They're animal eaters, right? So how does the way that we use our language limit or empower our ability to be effective?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we have to be, I believe, very careful in terms of how we use our language and tailor it to the audience. And just, remember, we're going to use different language for different audiences. And so there are some people who, feel very strongly that we should say, talk about murdering animals and not slaughtering or killing animals. And that's tricky because, first of all, murder is by definition, it's a legal definition. It's not an ethical definition, it's legal. So when you say that, you're automatically communicating that people who eat animals are murderers. And so I like to take the approach of the psychotherapist Terrence Real, who says he works with couples. You have a choice. You can be married or you can be right. You decide which you want to be. And I would say the same thing to vegans, not you could be married or you could be right, but you can be effective or you could be right. It may be true that this is a dead animal, this is not meat. However, as soon as you say that, you're going to trigger an emotional allergic reaction and the person listening to you. If you're talking to somebody you want to advocate to, and you're referring to food that they regularly eat as a dead animal, chances are you're going to turn them off to your message. But there are things that you can say that are less offensive and less jarring. So, for example, you can say eating animals as opposed to eating meat, sometimes, depending on where you are. And thanks to Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals, which sort of like popularized the expression more. You can say eating chickens and pluralize it rather than chicken. So you don't turn them into an abstraction, but you bring in the individuality into the statement. But again, it really depends on who you're talking to.
And actually, you know what? Let me go to the audience. Dominique V, if you can unmute yourself and state where you're from, and you can ask Melanie a question.
Hi, Melanie.
Hi.
I'm from Canada, French-speaking Canada. And oh boy, I have taken the Liberation Pledge, which is not attending, I guess, a meal with animal parts. But that has made me stop seeing my father. And I'm physically ill when I am at a table with a corpse like turkey or fish. But I would like to get back to talking with my father, but without losing face, because my father would be happy to belittle me. So how do I do this?
Did you say your father would be happy to belittle you?
Yeah, if I come back, like it would be like a victory for him, because I've said that I wouldn't take part in his dinner. Even if I had said that I would make the entire dinner myself, but he said no, I'd rather eat fish than have your company, basically.
I'm really sorry you're dealing with this. It sounds like, and I can hear it in your voice, a very painful situation. And from what you're describing, the problem sounds like it has much more to do with the relationship between you and your father, and in particular, the way your father relates to you, than it does with veganism, carnism. Underneath this difference is, a relationship between people. And if your father feels that, if he has a tendency to belittle you and would actually take pleasure in you feeling defeated and deflated, that's a bigger problem than the fact that you've got different, approaches to different ideologies when it comes to what you eat. I wrote a book called Beyond Beliefs, and it's a guide to improving relationships and communication among vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. And there are a lot of tips in there for people who are struggling with communication with other people who are, in this case, with somebody who's not a vegan. But it goes more deeply than just what to say. It really looks at the deeper relational dynamics with tips to address those as well, because I really do think there's probably more at play here than simply the difference in your dietary orientations or your ideologies. We have a video. It's a 7-minute video, and you can have a look and see if this would be something that's helpful to share with your father. And it's called What to Say to Vegans. And it's a video that shows what the world looks like through vegan eyes. For people who struggle to be able to communicate effectively what they're trying to with the people in their life. So maybe that will be helpful as well. And in Beyond Beliefs, there are also basically appendices. There are scripts that you can just photocopy and, if you feel disrespected by somebody in your life, which is, I think, what you're describing here, what you can say to communicate the way that you would like to be communicated with, to feel respected, and what that looks like to you. So you can link to, you can actually go to carnism.org for all of this information, carnism.org. The videos, all of our videos are on the homepage, and you can link to all of the books from there as well.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. Sounds like a good example of how other dynamics may play into the complications of communicating effectively with others. That's very interesting. So how do we come to this belief system? And is this just natural? This is just how belief systems are, and it's just it just arose naturally? Or was there some sort of strategy? Obviously, there are people who benefit from the system the way that this is. Have we been strategically I don't know if indoctrinated is the right word, but enculturated to have this belief system?
Yeah, I mean, Carnism has been around for a long time, and there are certainly, those who have a vested interest in maintaining the carnistic status quo. There's a lot of money, that's put into research to make sure that, people continue to feel comfortable enough to act against their values and, by eating animals and their own interests and the interests of others and our core values, for sure. So there are certainly vested interests in getting people to maintain their commitment to Carnism, but the vested interests are few and far between in a sense. I mean, we're talking about those who directly profit from Carnism. Carnism, as I said, it's an unjust system or an oppressive system, just like patriarchy is, or classism or racism. And, it evolved over time, over a long, long period of time, whether, I can't point to one point in its evolution. What I can say is that these systems stay alive. All of these systems, what my analyses and research has shown is that all of these different systems keep themselves alive by using what I describe as a two-pronged strategic approach. So let's look at Carnism. In order for Carnism to stay alive, it basically needs to ensure that it stays stronger than the counter system that challenges it. And the counter system is veganism. So basically, carnistic industry, let me just back up and say, because Carnism is so dominant, it's a dominant system. It's literally woven through the structure of society. It shapes norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, et cetera. It shapes all of our major social institutions, so when somebody studies nutrition, they actually study carnistic nutrition. And so in order to maintain itself, Carnism is constantly kind of promoting this meta myth, this overarching myth, right? The story that eating animals is the right thing to do. Eating animals is the right thing to do. It's normal, it's natural, it's necessary. It's the right thing to do. And making sure that we also believe the opposite of this. Not eating animals is the wrong thing to do. So carnism keeps itself alive by promoting these two myths. One strengthens carnism, strengthens support for carnism. The other weakens veganism. And the primary way this second myth gets played out or expressed, not eating animals is the wrong thing to do, is through negatively stereotyping anybody who represents veganism. And this is probably familiar to people, who are listening, people in the audience. There are so many negative stereotypes of vegans out there, of people who eat plant-based. These negative stereotypes are a way of shooting the messenger. If we shoot the messenger, we don't have to take seriously the implications of their message. And so this is also really important for those of us to understand who want to promote awareness, who want to promote more support for veganism, because we have to really debunk these stereotypes, or at least not buy into them ourselves. So, for example, you may have heard the stereotype of the sentimental or overly emotional vegan. Oh, you're just an animal lover. You're soft or whatever. But calling somebody over emotional is basically, people who are overly emotional are not rational, and people who are not rational are not worth being listened to. And when you look at, history, you can see that people who really challenged oppression were labeled as overly emotional. The suffragettes were called hysterical. Women shouldn't get the right to vote. You're hysterical women. The abolitionists, the abolitionists against African slavery were called sentimentalists. So, but when we think about it, the emotions that we may feel of sadness, of grief, of horror, these are appropriate, legitimate responses to the global atrocity that is carnism. Much more concerning is the widespread numbing and apathy of the dominant culture. The world needs more emotion, not less, when it comes to this issue. So this is one of many examples that I could give, but it's really important for people to recognize this, because otherwise we buy into them. When I was younger, before I did my research and analyses, I used to be ashamed of my sensitivity. I used to try to hide it when people teased me for being the sensitive animal lover. Now I'm proud of it. And grateful that there are more and more people in the world who are connecting with their sensitivity and helping to change the world because of it.
So to your point, in the health world, you'll have the idea, if someone is seen, if someone's very healthy, they exercise, they're doing everything right, they might be called a health nut. If somebody eats to the point where they become sick and need surgery or may die as a result of their own actions, to my knowledge, there's no term that questions their sanity. So the healthy person is a nut, and the person who's actually doing something to make them sick is completely rational.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really interesting point. There are definitely negative stereotypes against people, and it tends to be a class issue, actually, against people who are, overweight and eating junk food, for instance. But to your point, which I think you're saying, and I've seen this and spoken about it before too, and I think it's really important. This is actually another example of how, carnism, causes vegans, for instance, to have to live up to an impossible ideal. Otherwise, it becomes an excuse to erase everything we stand for. So we're hypocrites if we wear leather, but we're extremists if we don't, and God forbid, as you said, we get sick. I know so many people who hide the fact that they even have a cold because they're so worried that it's going to be used as an excuse to discredit their diet. When, as you said, the guy next door is quadruple, bypass surgery, quadruple bypass surgery. And it's like, oh, bad genetics.
Right. And you see this when people find out that you're whole food plant-based, they'll ask you where you get your protein, and they'll start talking about deficiencies, but and yet plant-based people are much healthier, and the general population, no one ever asks them like, oh, you're an omnivore, what are you deficient in, right? So as soon as you start talking about health, they start finding ways to say, oh, you're not perfect. Meanwhile, I think it was Michael Greger who said that the average plant-based eater is deficient in 3 nutrients, but the average omnivore is deficient in 7. So there's this blindness to that fact. So who tends to be open, or what characteristics would be indications of whether or not someone would be open to a vegan message and becoming that? Is there a sense that, some people who have cognitive dissonance with loving certain animals and eating others may be more open than somebody who doesn't even see that at all? They're completely blind to that.
Yeah, I mean, and for people who don't know what cognitive dissonance is, it's the internal discomfort that we feel when our values and our behaviors are not aligned. So if we care about animals, we don't want to contribute to their suffering, and yet we're eating them, then we would have cognitive dissonance. And some people are more aware of it than others and sensitive to it than others. It's a really good question. We need more research. I would say, for the purpose of being, practical, and people who are listening to this conversation, you can just ask, you'll know in a conversation whether somebody is open to what you have to say or not. And the bad news is, and the good news as well, is that there are over 8 billion people in the world today, and many of them are not ready to move toward a plant-based diet. And there are over 8 billion people in the world today, and many of them are, and it's really going for the low-hanging fruits. A lot of times we tend to focus on, like, oh my God, I've started this conversation, I've got to break through, I've got to win, I've got to advocate. But if somebody actually says to you that they're not interested, they don't really care, take them at face value and move on, because there are so many other people who really are at a different stage of readiness. And, the change that we need, that needs to happen in order to shift the trajectory the direction that our world is headed on right now, a collision course that we're headed on right now, is institutional. We need the big institutions to change. It's not enough to just be working on, obviously one person at a time. So everything that I'm talking about in terms of effective communication strategies applies to when we're communicating with, institutions, with, trying to get, if you're trying to get a school cafeteria to offer plant-based options, for instance. So if people say that they're open, keep the conversation going. If they shut it down, if they're not being respectful to you, of course, remove yourself from the situation. And give yourself permission not to have to be an advocate all the time. Sometimes you just want to be you and not on.
And I just enjoy your plant-based meal. So you have a hard stop at 10 a.m., is that correct? 10 a.m. Eastern?
I do, actually.
Okay, so then I'll just leave you we've got 2 minutes. I'll leave you to final thoughts, a message that you'd like to leave the audience, and perhaps what leaves you optimistic for the future in regards to what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. It's been a great conversation, and what leaves me optimistic is conversations like this. How many people, like you guys, reach so many people. The real truth about health. So many people, come together to have these important conversations, to learn, to grow, to spread the message, and to help create a better world. And every year there's more of us. Every year I've traveled to so many places in the world, over 50 countries, and everywhere I go, I see support for veganism, plant-based eating growing. And, and that's very, very inspirational. So, my inspiration is you guys. That's what keeps me going.
Well, thank you. You inspire us as well. So thank you so much, Melanie, for all that you do. And where can people find your work?
Carnism.org. All of the links that I described at carnism.org. I did actually mention something earlier about infighting. I have my organization and I have a new website, infighting.org, that has a lot of resources on it and a lot of links to effective communication strategies, how to self-regulate, how to identify dysregulation, and some of the other issues, how to not engage in shaming behaviors, the process versus content. So please visit infighting.org and share it if you like it.
Well, I really wish we had more time to go over that, because infighting, I've seen it just destroy any sort of forward momentum in the vegan movement. The amount of people fighting over personal conflicts is really a shame. So thank you for that. I definitely will check that out. And thank you so much for joining us today. If we could unmute the audience, please.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting. I'm going to go to your website. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is wonderful.
Yes.